They thought Tokyo was untouchable. For years, Japanese pilots believed the Pacific itself was a shield, a vast ocean no enemy could cross with enough force to threaten the heart of their empire. But on one cold night in 1945, that belief was shattered. The sky above Tokyo did not fill with clouds, it filled with wings. Hundreds of American B-29s moved in silent formation, black silhouettes carrying a new kind of weapon, one not designed to pierce armor, but to ignite entire cities. When the first incendiaries fell, Japanese pilots scrambled from their barracks, staring upward in disbelief. The horizon was burning. The air smelled of gasoline and melting steel. The night turned orange as if dawn had arrived hours too early. And in that moment, they understood something horrifying. This wasn't an air raid. It was a firestorm. And nothing in their training had prepared them for a sky that rained fire. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered a terrifying new phase, one where technology, desperation, and strategy collided in ways the world had never seen before. Japan's cities, once considered safe behind layers of distance and belief, were suddenly within reach of a machine designed to erase those illusions, the B-29 Superfortress. Massive, distant, and relentless, these aircraft carried not just bombs, but a message: America was willing to do whatever it took to end the war. Tokyo, the beating heart of the Japanese Empire, stood at the center of this storm. Its wooden houses, narrow streets, and dense neighborhoods made it a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And that spark arrived on the night of March 9, when General Curtis LeMay sent his bombers low and fast, carrying something far deadlier than explosives, incendiaries meant to swallow entire districts. As the first waves approached the city, Japanese pilots prepared for a traditional air defense. They expected high-altitude bombers, difficult but familiar. What they got instead was a tactic no one in Japan had imagined, a fleet that flew beneath the radar, dropped oceans of fire, and turned their capital into an inferno. This is the story of a night that changed the war, and stunned those who witnessed it from the sky. Before the firebombing fleet ever reached Tokyo, the Pacific War had already transformed into something far more brutal and unpredictable than the world had seen just a few years earlier. Japan entered the war believing its spirit, discipline, and warrior tradition would compensate for America's industrial might. For a time, that belief held. Victories in China, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies seemed to confirm everything Japanese commanders had preached, that courage could defeat machines, and that the homeland was too distant, too sacred, to ever be touched. But by 1944, reality was closing in. One island after another fell to the United States. Carrier groups moved closer. Submarines strangled vital shipping lines. And above it all, a new shadow appeared in the sky, the B-29 Superfortress. With a range longer than any bomber before it and the ability to fly higher than most fighters could reach, it was not just a weapon, it was a message. Japan's skies were no longer safe. At first, American raids were limited. High-altitude bombing failed to deliver decisive results. Strong winds, cloud cover, and inexperience meant the B-29s caused damage but not the kind that could break a nation. Japanese pilots and anti-aircraft crews felt confident. They believed the Americans lacked the precision to strike harder targets. They believed they could adapt. And then came General Curtis LeMay. Cold, brilliant, and ruthlessly efficient, LeMay understood something few others did. Japan's cities were built of wood and paper, ancient materials that had withstood centuries of time, but none of the modern tools of war. If he changed tactics, if he brought the bombers lower and loaded them with incendiaries instead of explosives, he could create not simple destruction, but a firestorm. Japanese intelligence knew America was desperate to end the war quickly. They knew the B-29 fleet was adapting. But what they didn't know, what they could not imagine, was that the next attack would not resemble the high-altitude raids they had trained for. Instead of scattered bombs falling from unreachable heights, they would face something entirely new, a citywide ignition, planned with cold precision. And as the night of March 9 approached, Tokyo was not preparing for flames. It was preparing for the wrong war. On the evening of March 9, 1945, as a cold wind drifted across the airfields of the Mariana Islands, the crews of the 20th Air Force prepared for a mission unlike anything they had flown before. There was no nervous chatter, no idle laughter, just a heavy silence broken only by the metallic clank of bomb latches and the distant rumble of engines warming up. These men had flown long, grueling missions over Japan before, but tonight felt different. Tonight's briefing had been blunt: you're going lower. Much lower. And you're carrying fire. The bomb bays of the B-29 Superfortresses were loaded not with the usual high-explosive bombs, but with racks upon racks of M69 incendiaries, small, deadly canisters filled with jellied gasoline designed to ignite anything they touched. Thousands of them. Enough to turn neighborhoods into infernos in minutes. General Curtis LeMay's strategy was simple, but terrifying. Strip the bombers of their defensive guns to lighten them. Fly them low to avoid high jet stream winds. Hit Tokyo in waves. Flood the city with fire. As the final checks were completed, pilots reviewed the flight plan one last time. The risks were enormous. Flying at low altitude meant Japanese anti-aircraft guns would have a clearer shot. It meant night fighters could close in faster. It meant far less room for error. But the crews trusted the reasoning behind the plan, and trusted each other even more. When the order came, the engines roared into life like a stampede of thunder. One by one, the massive bombers rolled down the runway, their wings heavy with incendiaries. Their tires lifted from the earth, and soon the sky above the islands buzzed with hundreds of engines merging into a single, deep hum. It sounded like the heartbeat of a metal giant. The fleet climbed slowly, then leveled off, forming columns that stretched farther than the eye could see. Pilots could make out flashes of silver in the moonlight as fellow bombers caught the glow, creating the eerie sight of a floating steel highway moving across the night sky. Below them, the Pacific Ocean appeared calm, unaware of the storm passing overhead. Ahead of them lay Tokyo, dark, densely built, and completely unprepared for what was coming. Thousands of men, flying thousands of miles, carrying a single purpose. Ignite a city. And break the will of an empire. Tokyo slept under a moonlit sky, unaware that an armada of steel thundered toward it. The city, crowded, wooden, and tightly packed, was quiet, its narrow streets dimly lit by lanterns and the soft glow of scattered windows. Children slept on tatami mats. Factory workers trudged home after late shifts. Air wardens made their routine patrols, believing the night would pass like any other. Then, at 12:08 a.m., the first American Pathfinders dropped their incendiaries. What happened next did not feel like an air raid. It felt like the sky had opened. Within minutes, clusters of M69 firebombs burst across the eastern districts, each one splitting upon impact and spraying burning gel into homes, shops, and alleyways. The flames clung to everything: paper walls, wooden floors, clothing, even skin. Small fires leapt into larger ones, and larger ones merged into torrents of flame that raced with the wind. A glowing orange wall began spreading across the city, devouring entire blocks in minutes. As more B-29s arrived, the fire grew into something monstrous. Witnesses described hearing a roar unlike anything they had imagined, a sound like a hurricane, but hotter, alive. The firestorm created its own winds, powerful enough to pull oxygen from the streets and send sparks swirling upward like fiery snow. Roofs collapsed. Wooden beams exploded from the heat. Entire neighborhoods were swallowed by rolling waves of fire. Sirens screamed through the city, but they were drowned out by crackling flames and the thunder of collapsing buildings. Families fled in desperation, clutching children and stumbling toward rivers, fields, or any open space not yet burning. Firefighters fought bravely, but their pumps ran dry, their hoses melted, and the heat forced them back again and again. For many, escape became impossible. The wind-driven inferno leapt ahead of fleeing civilians, turning alleyways into chimneys and streets into rivers of flame. People collapsed from heat and smoke before they could even reach shelter. The firestorm consumed oxygen so quickly that some simply suffocated where they stood. And high above this nightmare, the B-29 crews could see everything. From their windows, Tokyo looked like a giant burning vortex, bright orange in the center, fading to crimson and black at the edges. The smoke rose in a colossal pillar that twisted upward until it blended with the night sky. Even seasoned veterans who had bombed German cities were stunned. No one had imagined flames could spread this fast, or burn this hot. Tokyo, a city of millions, was being transformed into one vast, howling furnace. And the night was only just beginning. At airbases surrounding Tokyo, the first warning reports arrived in fragments, garbled radio signals, sightings of unidentified aircraft, confused messages about fires breaking out far too quickly and far too widely. Japanese pilots rushed from their barracks, fastening helmets, tightening flight suits, and sprinting toward their fighters. They expected a familiar scenario, enemy bombers approaching at high altitude, difficult to reach but predictable. But when they stepped outside and looked toward Tokyo, nothing looked familiar. The sky above the capital was glowing. Not with searchlights. Not with flares. But with fire. A red-orange dome pulsed above the city, rising higher every minute, like a second sun trying to push through the night. Even from miles away, pilots could smell the burning wood. The horizon flickered violently, shadows swaying across the airfields as if the earth itself were on fire. Scramble orders echoed across the tarmac, and engines roared to life. But as the fighters lifted off, the pilots realized their climb was taking them directly toward something terrifying, heat turbulence so strong it shook their lightweight planes. The rising heat from the firestorm created chaotic air currents, tossing fighters like leaves. Some pilots reported their instruments malfunctioning, unable to register altitude changes as the air around them rippled with scorching updrafts. As they approached Tokyo, the shock deepened. Instead of tightly clustered bombing patterns from high-altitude raids, the incendiaries had fallen in swirling corridors of fire. The city was burning in geometries no planner had ever imagined, entire districts shaped like glowing rivers, intersections shaped like flaming whirlpools. Pilots radioed in disbelief. This isn't bombing. Tokyo is erupting. The B-29s themselves were almost impossible to intercept. Flying low, fast, and through the smoke, they vanished and reappeared unpredictably. Searchlights failed to lock onto them. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't track them through the haze. Fighters struggled to climb above the rising smoke column that towered thousands of feet into the air. And even when Japanese pilots managed to spot a B-29, the heat rising from the firestorm distorted visibility so severely that many lost their target before they could even line up a shot. Some pilots returned to base without firing a single round, shaken, confused, and horrified. Others refused to break off and flew lower, desperate to engage, only to find themselves blinded by smoke or pushed off course by violent updrafts. The truth became unavoidable. This wasn't a bombing raid they could fight. This was a force of nature, one created by human hands, but beyond anything their training had prepared them for. Tokyo wasn't just under attack. Tokyo was burning itself alive. When dawn finally arrived on March 10th, the night's roar faded into a silence so heavy it felt unreal. The firestorm had died, but the destruction it left behind stretched across Tokyo like a scar carved by a giant's hand. Smoke hung in the morning air in thick gray sheets, drifting slowly over ruins that still smoldered. The city that once bustled with life, markets, factories, schools, crowded alleyways, was now nothing more than a vast, blackened plain. Entire districts had vanished. Where wooden homes once stood, there were only charred foundations. Where shops once lined narrow streets, there were only warped metal frames and piles of ash. Corpses lay where they had fallen, on roadsides, in rivers, in what remained of open courtyards, many unrecognizable, many never to be identified. Survivors moved among the ruins in stunned silence, their faces gray from soot, their clothes burned and torn, their eyes hollow from what they had witnessed. Japanese rescue units worked tirelessly, but the scale of destruction overwhelmed anything they had prepared for. Firefighters searched for survivors in the rubble, but found fewer than they hoped. Civilians formed bucket lines even though the fires had mostly burned out, unable to accept that there was nothing left to save. Doctors and nurses set up makeshift aid stations, treating burns, smoke inhalation, and injuries using supplies that ran out within hours. Then came the psychological shock. Japan's high command reviewed damage reports through the night, their expressions tightening with each new detail. Approximately 1/4 of Tokyo's urban area had been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were homeless. The death toll climbed higher by the hour. But what struck the leadership hardest was not the physical damage, it was the realization that their defenses had been almost useless. Anti-aircraft batteries had inflicted minimal losses. Fighters had been unable to intercept the bombers effectively. The city's wooden infrastructure had turned into a perfect fuel source for LeMay's new tactics. And worst of all, the firestorm had revealed a truth Japanese leaders had feared but never spoken aloud. The homeland was vulnerable. If one night could destroy so much, what would happen when the raids continued? How many cities could Japan lose? How much morale could the nation withstand before breaking? For civilians, the night became a trauma etched into memory, a moment when fear replaced confidence, when the idea of invincibility shattered. For the military, it was a strategic disaster. And for Japanese pilots, it was a revelation that the war was entering a phase they could not control. Tokyo had not simply been bombed. It had been transformed into a warning. A warning that the next night, any night, could bring the same fate. In the war rooms of Washington and Tokyo, the firebombing of Tokyo was not seen simply as a devastating attack, it was a turning point. A shift in the very nature of air power and the philosophy of war. For the United States, the success of the raid validated a controversial but brutally effective strategy. For Japan, it revealed that their greatest strength, the unity and resilience of their people, could be crushed not by invading armies, but by fire raining from the sky. General Curtis LeMay's gamble had worked. The decision to strip the B-29s of most of their defensive guns, lower their altitude, and rely on incendiaries was a radical break from traditional doctrine. Critics argued it was too dangerous, too unconventional, too morally questionable. But in one night, LeMay proved that the combination of long-range bombers and fire-based weaponry could obliterate a city more effectively than months of high-altitude precision raids. It also demonstrated something far more unsettling. Japan's urban landscape, crowded, wooden, flammable, was perfectly vulnerable to this new style of warfare. Tokyo was not an exception, it was a template. If the Americans repeated this tactic, dozens of cities could suffer the same fate. Japan's military leadership understood this immediately. Reports from civil defense units described the firestorm as unstoppable. Pilots described the air currents above Tokyo as unflyable. Anti-aircraft commanders admitted that low-flying bombers through smoke and darkness were almost impossible to hit. This was not a tactical failure, it was a structural one. Japan's entire defensive strategy had been built around intercepting high-altitude bombers, not fleets that moved like a wall of fire just above the rooftops. Worse still, the raid exposed the shrinking power of Japan's air force. Experienced pilots were gone, lost in earlier battles. Fuel shortages grounded many fighters. The few remaining planes struggled against the B-29's speed and altitude. For the first time, Japanese commanders were forced to confront a truth they had avoided. They could no longer protect their own capital. Across the Pacific, American planners saw the Tokyo raid as proof that the war could be ended without a costly invasion. If enough cities burned, if enough factories collapsed, if enough civilians fled from the flames, Japan's ability to fight might collapse entirely. The firebombing fleet had not only destroyed a city, it had reshaped the strategic landscape of the Pacific. It signaled that the final phase of the war was beginning, one where fire, not steel, would decide the fate of nations. And everyone knew what would come next. If Tokyo could burn, so could every city in Japan. Amid the grand strategies, the firestorm winds, and the clash of nations, the true weight of Tokyo's burning was carried not by generals, but by ordinary people, pilots, civilians, soldiers, mothers, and children whose lives were forever changed in a single night. And within this immense tragedy, countless human stories unfolded, each revealing a different face of the war. One Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Haruo Takahashi, later described the moment he flew over the city after the raid. His fighter shook violently from the heat rising below, but what shook him more was the sight beneath his wings. He expected scattered fires. He expected damage. Instead, he saw a city that looked like it had been erased. Blocks he grew up near, parks where he played, streets where he walked as a boy, were gone, replaced by a glowing sea of embers. He wrote, "I realized I was not flying over Tokyo anymore. I was flying over a memory." On the ground, a young mother named Aiko clutched her daughter as they fled toward the Sumida River. The fires moved faster than they could run, and people around them dropped from heat and smoke. She shielded her daughter with her body as sparks fell like burning rain. They survived, but their home, their belongings, and their neighborhood did not. Years later, she said she remembered only two things from that night: the sound of the firestorm screaming like a living creature, and the silence afterward. Meanwhile, American airmen returned to their bases exhausted, covered in sweat and soot. Many did not speak as they climbed down from their bombers. They had carried out their mission with discipline, but the view from above had shaken them too. Some watched entire districts vanish in minutes. Others saw the glow of burning neighborhoods stretching to the horizon. Although they fought for their country, few could ignore the human cost they had witnessed from miles above. For both sides, Tokyo's burning was more than a military event, it was a moment when the war revealed its deepest cruelty. A moment when technology outran humanity. A moment when a city of millions faced the full force of modern warfare. And long after the flames died, one truth remained. Wars are remembered through strategies and battles, but they are felt through the lives they change. Tokyo's night of fire did not end the war. But it changed how everyone, pilots, civilians, leaders, saw its end approaching. It showed that the Pacific was entering its final, darkest chapter. And that the cost of finishing the war would be higher than anyone dared to imagine. As the smoke of Tokyo's firestorm drifted into the upper atmosphere, the world stood at the edge of a new reality. The night of March 9 to 10, 1945, was not just another chapter in the Pacific War, it was a moment when the scale of destruction surpassed anything seen before. In a single night, one city had been transformed from a living, breathing capital into a landscape of ash and silence. And both nations understood that something irreversible had happened. For Japan, the raid shattered the belief that distance and tradition could shield the homeland. For the first time, the empire's heart had burned. Civilians who once trusted in the strength of the nation now faced homelessness, loss, and fear. Pilots who once believed they could defend the skies now realized they were confronting forces beyond their control, fleets of bombers that moved like storms, dropping fire instead of metal. For the United States, the mission proved that the war could be pushed toward its end not by invading beaches, but by breaking the infrastructure that allowed Japan to stand at all. Yet even among American commanders, a quiet question lingered: how far would they need to go? How many more cities would burn before surrender became possible? Tokyo's night of fire became a warning, a symbol, and a turning point. It revealed the power of modern air power, and the terrifying cost of using it. The flames that lit the capital illuminated the path ahead, but they also cast long shadows across the future of warfare. In the end, the firebombing of Tokyo was more than a military strike. It was a reminder that when nations clash, it is the innocent who burn the brightest. And on that night, the world learned just how devastating the fire of war could become.